For too long, Africa has been told it cannot survive without the West. But I am here to tell you we are stronger than they ever imagined. For decades, Western nations have presented themselves as generous benefactors to Africa, sending grains, soybeans, and other staples as aid. On the surface, it looked like a kind gesture, a way to help feed communities in need, but the reality was far more calculated. Every shipment of food came with subtle pressures designed to create dependence and secure political loyalty. It was a game played not in the headlines or flashy press releases, but behind the scenes where real power operates. Africans were told they were being helped. But in truth, the aid was a carefully disguised tool to control markets, dictate policies, and weaken local self sufficiency. The stage was set for a long-term power struggle that few outside policy circles fully understood. Behind the curtain, the strategy was simple but effective. Food became a lever of influence. Governments could threaten to cut off shipments to enforce compliance or reward cooperation. By undermining local agriculture, foreign powers ensured that communities would remain dependent on imported goods rather than grow their own staples.
Hmm.
Over time, this dependency created not just economic vulnerability, but political vulnerability as well. Leaders who resisted faced quiet pressures that could delay projects, cut off trade, or sway international aid. The underlying message was clear: survival came at the cost of autonomy. Yet in Africa, awareness began to grow. Leaders, farmers, and communities started noticing the patterns in the subtle strings attached. What looked like generosity was actually a method of control. And slowly, a philosophical shift began. Political sovereignty was being linked directly to agricultural sovereignty. If a nation could not feed itself, it could never truly be independent. This realization laid the foundation for a revolution that would eventually shock the world and reverse the flow of dependence. Food has always been more than just sustenance. It is a means of power, or in Africa, this became evident through the flow of U.S. soybeans and grains. For the American government and agribusiness, food was a commodity, a tool to enforce influence. The aid was not neutral. It was strategically designed to weaken local economies and prevent African nations from building their own self-sufficiency. Farmers found themselves undercut by imported crops priced lower than they could ever produce, leading to abandoned fields and disappearing knowledge. This weaponization of food was not an accident. American agricultural policy evolved over decades to ensure that surplus crops found overseas markets, even if it meant destroying the local agricultural foundation in Africa. Behind every shipment of soybeans was a calculation: maintain control over markets, make foreign governments reliant, and ensure that political alignment followed economic dependence. For African nations, this meant their growth was continually constrained by forces outside their control, with food acting as the invisible chain keeping them tied to the West. But the deeper impact was psychological. Communities that once prided themselves on self-sufficiency were told indirectly that they could not survive without outside assistance. The result was a slow erosion of independence, where survival required compliance and compliance required subjugation. African nations, however, began to question this system, realizing that control over food was control over their very sovereignty. This understanding would later drive a decisive break from dependency. U.S. agris and policymakers treated African markets as permanent outlets for surplus crops. Mechanized farming, subsidies, and overproduction created massive stockpiles that had to be exported. The strategy was straightforward: flood foreign markets, drive down local prices, and create dependency. Families that once grew their own crops were forced to buy imported goods at prices they could not resist. Knowledge of local cultivation began to fade, and rural economies weakened. On paper, this looked like aid, but in reality, it was a slow, deliberate method of control. The U.S. also used soybeans as leverage in diplomatic and political arenas. Access to food became conditional. Governments that complied with U.S. foreign policy goals received continuous supply, while those who resisted faced delays, rerouting, or outright bans. Through these mechanisms, Washington was able to influence voting in international forums, military agreements, and trade alignments, all while maintaining the appearance of generosity. The real weapon was subtle. It was the control of life-sustaining resources. Over time, this created a culture of dependence. Farmers and governments adjusted their expectations around imported goods rather than local production. Africa became a testing ground for a system that tied survival to obedience. But this dependency, though carefully constructed, was never permanent. African nations were slowly learning the patterns of leverage and building the tools to break free. African farmers and governments faced a slow strangulation of their autonomy. Imported food undercut local prices, eroding income and destabilizing markets. Rural economies stagnated, while knowledge of traditional agricultural practices declined. Communities that once thrived on self-sufficiency were increasingly reliant on foreign imports. This dependence went beyond economics. It affected social and political structures. Leaders who questioned or resisted faced invisible pressure, making it difficult to pursue independent policies. For decades, the system worked because the chains were invisible and subtle. African nations were trapped not by force, but by a combination of economic coercion, policy manipulation, and psychological conditioning. Yet, the seeds of resistance were quietly being planted. Observing these patterns, African leaders began linking self-sufficiency with sovereignty. They realized that the ability to feed one's population was central to independence. Slowly, they started taking measures that would eventually allow them to break free from decades of economic manipulation. Africa's awakening did not happen overnight. Years of observing the West's tactics, combined with strategic investments in local agriculture, laid the groundwork for a quiet revolution. Governments began funding research institutions to develop drought-resistant crops, reviving the seeds of local knowledge that had nearly been lost. Irrigation projects were launched to mitigate the effects of climate instability, while fertilizer and processing plants were built to reduce reliance on imported inputs. What was once a continent dependent on foreign grain slowly began to produce its own, not just for survival, but for long-term prosperity. Farmers were no longer passive participants. They were organized into cooperatives, giving them access to credit, machinery, and training that had previously been available only to large-scale producers. Mobile technology allowed even remote farmers to receive timely weather forecasts, market prices, and agricultural tips, connecting communities that had long been isolated. With education, resources, and organization, local farmers transformed from consumers of foreign aid into architects of their own sovereignty. The psychological impact was profound. Planting soy became a declaration of independence, and harvesting it was an act of reclaiming dignity. By the time the United States realized the full extent of Africa's preparation, it was too late. Silos in African countries were full, fields were productive, and crushing plants were operating at scale. The blockade of U.S. soybeans was not a rash protest. It was the culmination of decades of careful planning, investment, and resilience. Africa had not only learned to survive without foreign aid, but it had also developed the capacity to thrive on its own terms. Africa's liberation from dependency was not achieved in isolation. Strategic partnerships with countries like Brazil, India, and China played a critical role in reinforcing independence and providing alternative support systems. Brazil, once a victim of U.S. agricultural dominance, offered expertise in tropical soybean cultivation and shared scientific knowledge, helping African nations design systems suited to their own soil rather than replicating Western models. This exchange allowed African countries to benefit from proven methods without surrendering control. India contributed through adaptability. Its seed companies developed drought-resistant hybrids specifically for regions facing climate volatility, and its universities welcomed African students, making a new generation of agricultural experts. India's support was not charity. It was a collaboration designed to empower African nations, strengthen trade ties, and build sustainable local capacity. Meanwhile, China provided financial backing for infrastructure, including irrigation projects, processing plants, and roads to connect farms to markets. Crucially, these initiatives remained under African oversight, ensuring that foreign assistance strengthened sovereignty rather than replacing it. Together, these alliances created a safety net that rendered U.S. threats ineffective and active. By diversifying partnerships, Africa no longer had to rely on a single dominant power. Food aid, once a weapon of control, became irrelevant. Through collaboration and knowledge transfer, Africa was able to convert vulnerability into bargaining power, proving that independence could be achieved not only through self-reliance, but also through mutually beneficial global partnerships. While Africa was quietly building strength, the United States remained confident in its assumed control over global grain markets. For generations, American farmers were told that the world depended on their output. Surplus crops were seen as a national advantage, and African nations were assumed to be permanent customers. But when Africa rejected U.S. soybeans worth $124 billion, the consequences were immediate and devastating for the U.S. heartland. Silos overflowed, prices crashed, and entire farming communities faced financial collapse. Loans taken out against the assumption of endless demand became toxic, leaving farmers struggling to pay equipment, land, and operational costs. The economic shock was mirrored by a psychological blow. American farmers had been raised on the belief that they were indispensable, that their labor fed not only the nation, but the world. Seeing Africa thrive without their soybeans shattered that long-held myth. Beyond economics, the social and political ramifications were immense. Rural towns that had historically formed the backbone of U.S. political influence were destabilized, and local leaders faced angry constituents who demanded answers for a crisis that seemed to come from nowhere. Washington, once the architect of dependency abroad, found its own citizens suffering under the very strategy it had perfected. The irony was undeniable. A system designed to control Africa through food had in effect boomeranged. America's economic and cultural assumptions were shaken to their core. Farmers, bankers, and politicians were forced to confront a new reality. Africa had discovered independence, and the U.S. heartland for the first time in decades was paying the price. Africa's rejection of U.S. soybeans was more than an economic decision. It was a powerful declaration of sovereignty. By refusing to participate in dependency, African nations sent a clear message. The continent would no longer allow foreign powers to dictate its destiny through food. This was the beginning of a philosophical and practical shift. Agriculture, long treated as a means of survival, became a tool of political independence. Governments understood that controlling what their citizens eat meant controlling their nation's future. The symbolic value of food sovereignty cannot be overstated. Planting, harvesting, and processing crops locally became acts of defiance and empowerment. Farmers were no longer passive recipients of aid. They were active participants in nation building. This shift changed the mindset across the continent. Self-reliance became intertwined with dignity, and communities that once depended on imports now saw themselves as architects of resilience. The psychological impact of reclaiming control over agriculture rippled through societies, inspiring confidence in local governance and leadership. Food sovereignty also transformed Africa's standing on the global stage. No longer beholden to U.S. aid, African nations could negotiate trade partnerships and diplomatic agreements from a position of strength. The soybean blockade demonstrated that dependency was optional and independence was achievable. This strategic victory was a foundation for broader transformations across other sectors, proving that the chains of exploitation could be broken with foresight, patience, and collective action. The lessons learned from the soybean revolution were not limited to agriculture. Once African nations demonstrated that they could thrive without U.S. imports, it became clear that other sectors could follow the same path. Energy, minerals, finance, and trade became new arenas for asserting sovereignty. Governments began investing in local refineries, renewable energy projects, and processing plants, ensuring that raw resources were transformed domestically rather than exported for minimal value. The same principle applied to minerals and oil. Local processing meant local benefits, stronger economies, and reduced vulnerability to foreign manipulation. In finance, Africa's newfound confidence inspired innovation. Regional development banks, sovereign wealth funds, and digital currencies began gaining traction as alternatives to traditional Western financial institutions. By controlling capital flows within the continent, African nations reduced their exposure to external debt pressures and conditions previously tied to aid. These steps strengthened internal economies, created jobs, and encouraged trade partnerships that were mutually beneficial rather than coercive. Politically, the domino effect was equally significant. Food sovereignty empowered African states to assert themselves in international forums like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the G20. For decades, Western powers leveraged aid to influence voting patterns and policy decisions. With independence in food production, African nations could negotiate from strength, participate in global decision making with confidence, and reject policies that previously required compliance under threat of hunger or scarcity. The soybean revolution had shown that one carefully executed strategy could catalyze change across multiple sectors, creating a ripple effect of empowerment. Africa's success in agriculture inspired similar efforts in energy, minerals, and finance. For decades, Western companies extracted Africa's oil, uranium, and gas with little value added locally, leaving communities impoverished while profits flowed abroad. Today, African governments are investing in refineries, renewable energy grids, and local processing plants to capture the value of natural resources domestically. By processing raw materials at home, Africa ensures that jobs, revenue, and technology remain within the continent, strengthening economic resilience and reducing dependence on foreign powers. In finance, the shift was equally transformative. With the lessons of the soybean blockade in mind, African nations began exploring alternatives to Western controlled financial institutions. Regional banks, sovereign wealth funds, and digital payment systems gained importance as tools to support local economies and finance development on African terms. By taking control of capital flows, Africa reduced vulnerability to foreign loans and conditions, giving governments and communities greater autonomy over economic decisions. Minerals, energy, and finance were no longer just commodities. They became symbols of freedom. Each investment, infrastructure project, and innovation sent a message. Africa would no longer accept extraction without benefit, nor dependency without control. This approach fundamentally altered power dynamics with the West. The continent, long portrayed as weak or reliant, now wielded authority in key global markets and industries. The principle was clear. Control your resources and you control your destiny. The soybean revolution and subsequent strategies were just the beginning. Africa's ability to reject U.S. soybeans while building partnerships with Brazil, India, and China shows that the continent is capable of self-determination in every sector. Food was only the first battlefield, but the logic spreads to energy, minerals, finance, and diplomacy. If Africa can achieve independence in agriculture, there is no reason it cannot reclaim control over every facet of its economy. For the West, these developments pose a challenge unlike any before. Traditional tools of influence such as aid, trade leverage, and resource control are no longer guaranteed to work. The assumptions that African nations are permanently dependent have been shattered. Washington and other Western powers are now witnessing the consequences of underestimating Africa's patience, intelligence, and strategic planning. The same policies that once ensured control are now creating vulnerability, forcing a rethinking of global power dynamics. Looking ahead, Africa stands at the threshold of unprecedented autonomy. The continent has demonstrated that careful preparation, investment in local knowledge, and strategic alliances can overturn centuries of imposed dependency. The $124 billion soybean blockade may have seemed symbolic, but its implications are historic. It represents a turning point, a declaration that Africa will no longer be dictated to by foreign powers. The future belongs to those who control their destiny, gain